Okay, everyone. Tonight we are hosting two very distinguished people from that are going to speak about the UNDRIP. UNDRIP means United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples, and these are experts in the field. The last time I heard about UNDRIP was about last year. We were hearing a lot about it. But hardly anybody paid attention, I don't think. But I think now we're capitalizing on the moment, especially what's going on in BC. And I'd like you to think about those children that were found and didn't have a chance to live out their lives. It's been very horrific for a lot of us that went to boarding school. And so I don't want to dwell on that because we do have a future to go ahead with us here. Okay. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people of the past, present, and future while recognizing and respecting cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationships to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Okay, so I'll introduce Sharon in just a moment. But before we start, I just want to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A, question and answer. If you have questions, do put them in there and I will sort them as we go. And then you can ask the speakers questions as you would like more information. We'll do that right at the end. We also have today Perry Stein, who works for the city of Lethbridge. And I'm from the Lethbridge Public Library. My name is Linda Weaselhead. And I have been working there for the last 3 years. It's been a joy. And we do a lot of partnering with Truth and Reconciliation, as well as the city of Lethbridge on many projects. Okay, Perry, we'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, tanse. Good evening, everyone. My name is Perry Stein. I'm the Indigenous Relations Advisor at the City of Lethbridge. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us this evening to celebrate National Indigenous Peoples Day and Indigenous Peoples History Month in Lethbridge. A special thank you to the Lethbridge Public Library for helping us organize today's presentation, and to the Reconciliation Lethbridge Advisory Committee, who has been coordinating the community's various events to celebrate this day, this week, and this month. And finally, an important thank you to Dr. Leroy and Dr. Sharon Venne. We appreciate your time and your perspectives, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say to help us as a community better understand what the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples means to us as a community. We know it's gaining a significant amount of attention right now with its travel through Parliament and the Senate, and we're all anxiously kind of looking to understand what this means for the future of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. So thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and thanks again to everyone for joining us tonight.
Okay, we'll get started. Tonight we're, like I said, we have two speakers. I'm going to introduce them separately. The first speaker is Sharon Venne, Sharon Venne. Her Cree name is Notoqui Musqua Manitokan. If I mispronounce that, I apologize, and Sharon can correct me. But she's an Indigenous treaty person, and by marriage, a member of the Kainai Nation. Sharon is an internationally recognized expert on Indigenous laws, norms, and rights, and has written and lectured extensively across the world, including in Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, France, Italy, Hawaii, United States, and Canada. Ms. Venne's work with the United Nations was instrumental to the establishment of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Peoples, the development of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN studies focusing specifically on treaties. Sharon currently lives and works in Treaty 6 territory. Sharon, we'd like to welcome you, and we'll give you a big oki from all of us here in Blackfoot territory, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Hi. Nia no te mantoka. That's how you say my name.
Oh, okay.
It's okay. Ani Beason Squaw. I'm from the Thunderbird Bear Clan also. I am Cree by birth, and I am a member of the Kainai. So we have a son. I have a son also who's a member of the Kainai. I have worked at the United Nations since before the creation of the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples in 1982, and helped to formulate a resolution that created the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples. And this working group this is in 1981-82, and this working group was the one that was charged in the mid-1980s to elaborate a declaration or a statement about the rights of Indigenous peoples within the international legal regime. The result of the work of the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples was the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with an S at the end of peoples. It was a very controversial time in the United Nations, because countries like Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, other countries where Indigenous peoples are located, really resisted the idea of having an S on peoples, because S on peoples refers to the right of self-determination under international law, and it's encoded in many other legal instruments within the United Nations. And so Indigenous peoples really fought hard throughout the late 80s and early 1990s to have the S included as on people. So I always insist that people have, when they're talking about it, they should always refer to peoples, because it was a long, hard battle, and we finally got it adopted. Like, for example, in 1982 or 83, the government, the United Nations decided that they're gonna give us a year, and they referred to this the International Year of Indigenous People without the S. So all of us used to travel around with black markers, permanent markers, and put the S on all the posters so that people would see Indigenous peoples rather than International Year of Indigenous People. And it's very significant because peoples have a right to land and resources. Indigenous peoples enter into treaties. Peoples without the S in international law are referred to as minorities, which is the cultural rights, social rights, language rights. But Indigenous peoples, we have rights, including human rights, and our rights are not limited only to human rights. So we always have to remind people of that, because people have a tendency to fall into the proverbial trap of only referring to cultural rights and not reflecting on the larger implications of the rights of Indigenous peoples who were here at the time before contact. So the Declaration is a reflection of international legal norms, because the original United Nations drafting only referred to individual rights, and we hold our rights collectively. And so it was an important international development that the United Nations moved towards the recognition of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And in doing so, they moved the yardstick, I guess we ought to say, in the recognition of rights, and started moving away from the idea that Indigenous peoples were victims of violations to actually participants in making decisions about the future of where they wanted to go in relation to their future generations. So it wasn't an easy task. I mean, I'm not going to say it was easy. It was a lot of work, and there was a lot of lobbying that needed to take place, and a lot of effort to try to talk to all these different governments about what the rights of Indigenous peoples were. Like the first time people went to the United Nations in 1977, the members working within the big building of the Palais des Nations, if you go there, it's a humongous building. It takes about, if you're a good fast walker like I am, you can go from one end of the building to the other in 20 minutes at a lickety split, if you're moving at a good pace. If you're sort of ambling along, it's going to take you a lot longer. But in this giant building full of people, when Indigenous people showed up in 1977 for the first conference on Indigenous peoples and in the Americas, people were hanging out of the windows looking at the Indigenous peoples coming in, because they came in with the drums. And a lot of the functionaries within the system were surprised that Indigenous peoples were still alive, because the popular story or myth that had been created was that we had been exterminated and were no longer alive. So they were quite amazed to actually see real Indigenous peoples. And over the course of the next 20 years, Indigenous peoples made a real impact in the system. I can't even begin to tell you the kinds of things that we did. I mean, for example, the UN never used to allow people to have an opening prayer. That was a kind of because of the different peoples and different religions and all that sort of stuff all over the world. They always said no opening prayers. But we convinced them over a period of time that part of our traditions, our way of thinking and doing things, is that we always thank the Creator before we start anything major. And so now it's quite common to go to the UN and people will say, the secretariat in the meetings will say, do you have somebody here who's prepared to do the opening prayer? If you could tell them, they could come here, sit here. There'll be, the mic will be open. Do you need to translate it, or because the translators are there? Because if you want to translate whatever they're saying, we can do that too. Like, they're very accommodating now. Even at one meeting I was at about 3 years ago, they had a Dene prayer drum song as the opening, and they had no problem with that. So we, it may not seem like a lot, but it is a big deal. And so we've got done that, and people can go in their own rights at different meetings. They don't need to be accredited by governments to be able to speak in meetings. That's another big issue that confronted us, and how we were treated when we came into the building. So there's been movement at the international level, and I think people have to remember that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is only one international standard. There are other international standards that are being worked on right now. Like, for example, the World Intellectual Property Organization has been working on how intellectual property of Indigenous peoples will be treated within WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva. There's been work done at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, on how Indigenous peoples will be treated and accommodated, using that infamous boogeyman word, free, prior, and informed consent, which always sends people through the roof, which is really not, a major thing to get hysterical about, but it has a long history within international law about peoples having a right to free, prior, and informed consent, which when the UN recognized us as being peoples, we've always considered ourselves peoples, but when the UN said, yes, you are peoples, that also came along and recognized at the international level. But really, it's something that was recognized in Canada going back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the Crown said that you cannot enter and use resources of the Indigenous peoples without their or tell them what you're doing, giving their consent, and then moving on. So it's always there. I don't know why people have gotten it in their head this is something brand new. Maybe it's politics, I don't know what. But we're also doing work with the WHO, the World Health Organization, on developing standards in relation to traditional medicines and accessing traditional medicines and how these will be treated. There's a whole system, there's a whole unit within the World Health Organization that deals with these issues. It's not just Indigenous peoples that deal with traditional medicines. There's a lot of people, even in Europe or in Africa and other places where traditional medicines are quite common. So, there's a lot of work being done in different venues within the United Nations system, because human rights is only one component of the area. So when the declaration was originally adopted in the early 1990s by the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples, which was comprised of 5 international legal experts, one from Asia, one from Africa, Eastern Europe, as they call it, Western Europe, which Canada is a part of, and Latin America. Those are the 5 regions of the world, and as set up by the United Nations. They had 5 legal experts who actually adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a standard, and then it went to the subcommission on the rights of Indigenous, or on the subcommission on discrimination. That subcommission also adopted the document, and the next step was supposed to be that the Commission on Human Rights would have adopted it, but Canada, bless their little hearts, created a new entity at the Commission on Human Rights, which never existed previously in the UN system. They created this group called the Intersessional Working Group, a whole new beast in the UN system. And really what it was designed to do was to try to diminish and to destroy the working group draft, and to take apart the working group draft. And they tried that from 1993 until 2005. They gave it their best shot. State governments came in and argued, and Indigenous peoples came in and held their own, and there was a lot of to and froing and stuff like that. And then eventually, they ended up sending it to the General Assembly, which eventually, got adopted. But it's a declaration, and a declaration in the UN system is the lowest legal instrument of the UN system. So the declaration itself is not legally binding on state governments at this time, because it needs to be converted from a declaration into a convention. And that is not on a foreseeable horizon. But it is still an international standard that people can look to and use for themselves to promote their rights in relation to state governments. There's other mechanisms in the UN that can also help to promote it and to use some of the standards that have been identified in the document. So it's been, I would say, we started the work in 1974 with the original drafting that was done by Indigenous peoples, because all along the way, people have to realize that this was an Indigenous-led initiative. State governments did not want us to have any kind of international standards at all, and so they have resisted all along, and resisted with every mechanism that they could possibly dream of, and tried to put it in the path of Indigenous peoples. And so it was a lot of hard work, because we had to do our own research and prepare our own materials, and very few international legal scholars were really prepared to assist us. Now that the declaration was adopted in the General Assembly, I would say everybody and their proverbial dog now comes out and says that they were involved in helping us. I was there. I know who was there and who wasn't. And a lot of these people writing stuff now, they weren't in the place. So I can attest to that because I know who was there and who wasn't. But I think the thing about the work is that at Indigenous peoples, the first working group of Indigenous peoples in 1982 had 12 Indigenous peoples present. By the time the declaration was adopted at the working group, there was probably 2,000 Indigenous peoples there. It was the largest meeting outside of the General Assembly in the UN system. Indigenous peoples from all over the world came and participated in the drafting. So it was quite a collaborative approach on our part. I just want to give you one, short example about how we work together. We used to meet amongst our, as Indigenous peoples, we'd have a room, and the UN would make available the translators because a lot of Indigenous peoples are working in, different colonial languages. So we had translators in, English, French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic. So not so much Chinese, but they were there. And so people were having their own translators because I'll just give you an example of how this worked. The Inuits came in, to the working group, and they were very concerned about putting inside the declaration that sea ice would be protected by the declaration. And so they made their case, and their old people were speaking in Inuktitut. And then it was translated from Inuktitut into English. And then it was translated from English into the rest of the UN languages. And it was kind of a funny experience because at one point, David Yanomami, who is from the Yanomami people in Brazil, couldn't figure out why people would be so interested in protecting ice. He had never seen sea ice. He didn't know anything about sea ice. The only ice that he'd ever had encountered was something that you put in a drink to keep it cold. And he thought that was a great diminishment of the declaration that we were working on if we put in ice. So then the people from the Inuktitut had to explain to them why this was important, what was the significance of sea ice to them and their environment and their relationship with with their environment, and it's critical to their to their livelihood. And so so then back and forth, and they finally came to the realization that yes, this was a really important part to be in the declaration. And it wasn't the original declaration, but when it was amended in New York, it was removed, unfortunately, from the final product by the state governments. But I think it's a critical piece that should have been kept in, because now we see what global climate change and everything, diminishment of sea ice is a hugely important issue. But anyway, I digress. But I just wanted to give you an example of the kind of discussions that were had. And the one of the big areas that was discussed also was related to climate change, was the issue of with the flooding of small island nations or coastal areas where Indigenous peoples live. As the sea ices and the ice and the water in the oceans rises, these small islands and coastal areas are subject to flooding, and also for people being displaced. And so the question came, when you move a whole population off an island and you relocate them to another place, do they retain the characteristics of being Indigenous? And do they have, in this place that they would be moved to, the same ability to maintain their cohesive relationship with the new land and their new environment? So these are some of the some big issues that we're trying to tackle and trying to put together for the declaration, because we're not only thinking about today but thinking into the future. So it was a very inclusive document where people brought a lot of information to the UN system so that this document would be reflective of them. and their wants and needs. The other critical area I remember having a bit of a shock, I guess I would say on my part, is that Rigoberta Menchú, Tum, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, first Indigenous person ever to receive it, her issue was she wanted to really see in the declaration that Indigenous peoples should not be conscripted into national armies, because in Guatemala and other places in South and Central America, this was occurring. And then Indigenous people were put in the armies and then turned against their own people and as part of the army. And this was very distressing to them. I was distressed from it because in our treaty that we made with the Crown in Queen Victoria, we are not forced to fight in the Queen's wars. If we want to join up, we can, but they cannot conscript us. So that was, an interesting thing for, to learn about what was happening to them, and then how important that was to go into the declaration. So there was a clause drafted and inserted. So each one of those clauses in the declaration is a story that can, maybe someday somebody will write that book and say this is what the clause is, this is why it's there, and this is why it was introduced, which I think would be an interesting. I think it'd be interesting for people to know that, because it was not a document that was generated by international legal experts for us. It was us telling these international legal experts, these are what we consider our rights, and this is what we want to see in the documents. So now we need you to find appropriate language in the international community that reflects what we want, not the other way around, which is really an important distinction, as opposed to what most of what happens now, even in Canada. Now Canada, drafts documents and then sort of reveals them, and says, here's what we've done for you. That's really continuing the colonial legacy, and we need to stop that. There needs to be some way to work with our peoples that we can be instrumental in the creation of these documents, rather than state governments deciding who they're going to talk to, who they don't want to talk to. So that's something that the Declaration can teach everyone, how to include people, even if you may not understand, or maybe at the initial thought not really like what people are saying, but you have to try to understand where they're coming from and why that's important, and see if there's a way to accommodate that. I think that's the lessons of the Declaration, because that idea has permeated now throughout the system. I'm talking about the United Nations system, I'm not talking about other systems, but within the United Nations system, Indigenous peoples are seen as having contributed very valuable things to the work. They've changed the way the United Nations works, because when they created the Special Rapporteur on Treaties, when he came to Canada for his first visit to meet with treaty peoples directly, the United Nations was, I would say, slightly hysterical. Let's put it that way. From 1946 until 1989, when the Special Rapporteur on Treaties left the building to travel into the communities to listen to people directly, it never been done. All studies in the United Nations up until that point had been done in-house in Geneva, in the Human Rights Center, where, and the materials were ordered in a mass from all over the world, but nobody actually went there and talked to people. So when the rapporteur left the building, they were, like, where's he going? What's going to happen? Like they were a little bit, I would say, apprehensive about a special rapporteur going into an Indigenous area because you don't know what kind of people those are. They might be dangerous. Anyway, so he did it. And now, today, rapporteurs who do not travel into the area that they're studying are considered not to be, who have not done a good job. So Indigenous peoples changed that within the system. So we did make systemic changes at that level also. So, the Special Rapporteur on the Environment travels to environmental issues. Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food is traveling. Special Rapporteur on the Right to Water is traveling. So all these special rapporteurs who work in these different areas are on the road all the time, traveling to all these different areas and looking at things themselves. Not during pandemic, but prior to pandemic, and I'm sure after things get back to somewhat normal, they will be back on the road again, because that's how Indigenous peoples have forced the system to change. So I think I'm at the end of my time, and thank you very much. First of all, I guess I should have said that at the beginning, but I'll say it at the end. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this. And it's a very difficult time for our people. Our people have been saying this, and there are documents at the United Nations that were filed by our own people about people that disappeared in these residential schools, never to be seen again, never heard from. And they were documented, but for some bizarre reason, I don't know, maybe it's colonization or people don't want to look at it. Nobody wanted to, the governments and other people didn't want to admit that this is what had occurred. And I myself lost my one of my aunts. We don't know where she is. We don't know where she was buried. We know she passed away, but we don't know where they put her. And so it's very difficult for us as a family. And we've had a lot of conversations in the last few weeks about what we're going to do as a family about that. And because we have never really spoken about it, but now we think we should, because she had tuberculosis. She was sent to a tuberculosis hospital in southern Saskatchewan, from a long ways from where we are. And then in the middle of December, the hospital decided to send her and 14 other children north towards Prince Albert, Saskatchewan in the 1920s. And they all perished in the wintertime and were buried along the route somewhere. We don't know where she is buried, but we do know that much. So we don't know who the other children were that were with her. We don't know when she died. We don't know anything like that, but we know she passed away. So it's a very tough time for everyone. But if we're going to confront what's happened to our peoples, people have to know the truth. And when you know the truth, then you can start making changes. So that's what we did when we drafted the declaration. We told the truth to the members of the UN and said, this is our truth. So what are you going to do? Are you going to help us or not? And they did. So that's how come that you see the document that you see now. And it is 50 years in the making. I always tell people I was a child in a cradle board when I went to the United Nations in the first time. And I'll just end with this. One of my Mohawk friends said to me, Sharon, I'm not calling you a liar. I'm not saying that you're lying, but it must have been the biggest cradle board in the history of cradle boards. Then he has a dramatic pause and said, and your mother must have been a weightlifter. Yikes. Okay, so we can't do the cradle board story anymore. So thank you very much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you, Sharon. That was I'm very humbled by your story. We don't know the work that goes behind it. I know there was a few people here that were really strong advocates, including Leroy, who we're going to hear next. I would like to save the questions for at the end, so to give you both an opportunity to answer them. So Leroy, Perry, did you have anything you'd like to add?
No, nothing to add. Looking forward to hearing Leroy. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, Thank you. Okay, our next speaker, who is very well known in this area, not only for his knowledge, but for his subtle humor that I find so amazing at times. He's a brother to my friend, his sister, and I think somehow we're related. But anyways, Dr. Leroy Little Bear is a Kainai elder, community leader, and current special advisor to the president of the University of Lethbridge. Dr. Little Bear has made significant contributions to Indigenous and Canadian society in the areas of education, law, justice, and Indigenous rights. Some of his many accomplishments include the enshrinement of Indigenous rights in the Constitution of Canada, the development of the University of Lethbridge's Native American Study Program, an early model for many of the current Indigenous studies programs around North America. Excuse me. Advocacy for First Nation and Métis peoples within the criminal justice system in Alberta, and perhaps most significantly, contributions to the creation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Leroy currently lives and works in Lethbridge, Alberta. Okay, Leroy, I'll turn it over to you now, and I'll sit back and enjoy your discussion.
Okay, nisto nakauki ka skinua. He naksi scan now. Sauki tapioa. I'm very honored to be here with you this evening, and I want to thank the Lethbridge Public Library for putting on this type of engagement session, let me put it that way. I want to thank Sharon for her wonderful presentation, and I'm very honored to be asked to share thoughts with our audience. I was asked to speak to the UN Declaration and kind of its local application, how we might want to implement the UN Declaration locally. So it'll be from that perspective that I'll be speaking. Let me start off as follows. Canada has signed a whole number of international conventions on human rights. And let me list a few of them. The Genocide Convention in 1952, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1969, Convention on Civil and Political Rights in 1976, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, also in 1976, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against women in 1981, the Convention Against Torture in 1987, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2008, and now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These conventions that we've just listed should part of the framework for all institutions across the country, corporations, businesses, and schools. But how many of us are familiar with these conventions? They have been signed by our country, by Canada. Canada is our country. And they've been signed by Canada. But do we ever pay attention to them? See? In other words, there must be, when we're talking about human rights, when we're talking about racism, when we're talking about discrimination and so on, there must be a problem. Because if there wasn't a problem, there wouldn't be all these conventions. There must be a problem globally. See? And so we, as citizens of this country, since our country came forward to sign all these conventions, and now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we, the people of this country, should be familiar with them. And we should know what they're all about. They should be part of the framework of our institutions, our governments, our schools, and so on. So, the UN Declaration, for instance, speaks to self-determination. Well, we've been talking about, for instance, something that everybody seems to be aware of is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. And it seems that, yes, our institutions are responding to the challenge and are doing something about the challenge that was thrown out by the commission. Well, you can look at the TRC as something that's local, that's national. And the equivalent of it at a global level that speaks to the same issues, as Sharon was pointing out, is the UN Declaration. So it seems that Lethbridge, for instance, our local community here, is going down the right pathway by meeting with the local reserves, the local reserve communities, and in this case, the Blood Tribe, and entering into an MOU, and which I understand they will actually sign later this year, sometime in September. That's a real step forward. It's a step that hasn't happened. As Sharon was saying, there are certain things that happened within the process leading up to the UN Declaration that had never happened before. Well, an MOU being signed between a city like Lethbridge and the local Indigenous community is something that has never happened before. See? So it's a very good first, but a big step forward. The Declaration addresses the right to life, integrity, and security. Well, all we have to do is think about Kamloops. Kamloops is on everybody's mind. There was just a big support in Ottawa of trucks that were lining up down the road supporting, Indigenous children. And, it is a reminder of interference in the lives of Aboriginal peoples. That is, the residential schools. So schools and educational authorities should be aware of these sections of the Declaration that speak to curricula type issues and then are much more culturally, friendly. And so I see local schools such as Catholic Central, it's got an Indian name, Tatsikiohis. University of Lethbridge, it's got a Blackfoot name, Iniskin. It's got a song and an honor song that goes with the name and so on. And the university, as we speak, is going through the whole exercise of indigenization. Those are fantastic steps forward with regard to truth and reconciliation and fulfilling the goals of, the UN Declaration. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People speaks to culture, religious, and linguistic identity. But how many of our schools teach native languages, for instance? You see, linguistic diversity is really a strength. It broadens the epistemological scope of students' minds. Diversity really is strength, not a weakness. So teaching Blackfoot, Cree, and other Indigenous languages within our school is really going to strengthen our society as a whole. But have we started into that process of strengthening our society? Well, the UN Declaration is urging us to do just that. The UN Declaration, I should say, addresses free, prior, and informed consent. And these usually speak to issues arising from mining, oil explorations, and other types of development that need to be more respectful of our church, that is, the indigenous church. What is the indigenous church? It's the land. The land is our indigenous church. See? And just as, if we were to walk into any church, Christian or otherwise, you would not want anybody to come and desecrate, mess things up in your church. Well, as Sharon was pointing out, hey, we don't want anybody to come and desecrate and mess up things in our church, which is the land. And that's why our people are always talking about the sacred aspect, the respect for the land. And, so this is what our governments, provincial, federal, local, have to be aware of. And some of our sacred sites have to be, respected. An example of this is this sacred rock over there by Okotoks, in Blackfoot, it's Okotok. If you go over there, that rock is very special to our people. It's a sacred rock. But if you go over there, it's been vandalized, it's been desecrated, it's got beer cans all over the place, and so on. People come to party over there, and so on. Say, those are the kind of things we're talking about when we're talking about respect for the land. And people misinterpret these notions that are spelled out in the UN Declaration when it says free, prior, and informed consent. Well, if you stop and think about it, free, well, nobody should have to force you into something. It should be free, freely done. See? Prior means, hey, we have to have the information ahead of time so that we can make considered decisions. Informed, hey, we have to have all the information so that we can make decisions with all the information required. And consent, well, to be able to say yes and no when we have all this information based on, based on good information that was brought to us, we had time to study it, and so on. See, that's what that section talks about. But so often, governments move forward without consulting our people. See, it's not to say Native people have a veto on development. See, because sovereigns talk to each other. When Canada and the United States are going to enter into an agreement, they talk with each other. That's what it's about. See? So, treaties and other agreements are protected by the Declaration. And we should all be familiar with those treaties. Why? Because we are all treaty people. Non-Indigenous people have a great misunderstanding about Indian treaties. Indian treaties are not one-sided. It takes two parties to make a treaty. See? And non-Indigenous people were represented by the Crown. See? Your representatives, you were represented by the Crown. We were represented by our leaders. See? They came together to make a treaty. And if we look at those treaties from that perspective, then we'll have a much better understanding about them. And consequently, those treaties should be taught in the schools as early at as early an age as possible, so that people will know what the relationship is all about. See, remember, we are all treaty people. See. So, school curriculums should include treaties. They should be taught in school. Now, the rights, the Declaration speaks to, as I mentioned, there's a convention to protect women. It speaks to the rights of Indigenous women. Why? Because women are the source of life. See, and men, the males, sometimes forget that. If it wasn't for our women, they wouldn't exist. See? So we have to remember, women are the source of life. And they are entitled to the greatest of respect and honor. Just as there are systemic barriers against Indigenous people, well, there are as many systemic barriers against women, and especially Indigenous women. All you have to do is listen to the stories about employment, services, police, and so on. You begin to know the concerns that the UN Declaration is attempting to address. We don't have to go very far. We heard about Kamloops. Well, right here in southern Alberta, all you have to do is go over here, just to the south of Calgary, at a place called Dunbo. There was a mass grave there, okay? And there probably is more of that, okay? When we're talking about women, hey, all you have to do is remember that lady in British Columbia that was denied service to give birth in a hospital. You know, see, those things are happening. See, and consequently, why we end up having to come up with these kind of documents. See, well, Lethbridge, our local community and our local schools, our university is doing something about the TRC challenge. And it seems Canada is now rising to the UN Declaration challenge. And our government has now decided to go ahead and adopt the UN Declaration and make it part of Canadian law. So we'll be seeing that moving forward in the next few months. So I thought I'd throw these ideas out, but my main message is our country has signed all these declarations. We should be familiar with them. Our institutions, our businesses, our corporations should be aware of them and make them as part of their overall framework. See, but too often we don't pay attention to them. And many people don't even know the existence of all these conventions on human rights, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for allowing me to share these few thoughts with you on the rights of, on this Indigenous Day and on the rights of Indigenous people. Thank you.
First of all, Dr. Leroy, I want to give you my heartfelt thanks. I've heard you speak at a number of occasions, and each time I gain something new. I'm old now, but every day I'm learning something new from, like you said, the land. Like I knew that when I grew up, but I had mentioned earlier the heart of Blackfoot Confederacy land, I was told, is writing on stone, where they left writings, not writings the way we do today, but the writings and the stories are all there. And they were protected now by the UNESCO. They were named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, I believe, in 2018. And there is still vandalism happening. We were told that some of the people that go there even take the offerings that have been made, which was sad because they don't understand about those offerings, why we do that. So I appreciate and am really honored to be in your presence. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Okay. So next, I want to go to the Q&As, and I'll give you both an opportunity to respond. We want to make sure we cover that. So this one says, currently many of our schools do not have sufficient numbers of Indigenous teachers. What role should non-Indigenous teachers play in the sharing of Indigenous ways of knowing, particularly those teachers who are in daily contact with Indigenous friends, being invited to ceremonies, and engaging at a point beyond schools? And what about the resistance to non-Indigenous teachers taking on instructional roles in partnership with knowledge keepers?
Let me respond to that kind of question, comment. I used to say, and I used to blame our universities because the universities turn out, and to some extent it's still true, turn out teachers as though they were going to be teaching in a unicultural classroom, see. But then when you go out through the province, you go to any classroom, you'll be hard put to find a unicultural classroom. So what our universities should be doing is turning out teachers who can teach in a multicultural setting, okay? They don't have to be experts in every cultural setting, but they should know a little bit about their audience. In other words, their students, where they come from and so on, what their cultural backgrounds are. And in fact, by doing that, they'll make better connections to those students and be much more effective teachers to those students, see. And, you know, I'm not being biased because you work at the University of Lethbridge, but our university is trying very hard to do just that, you know, and having more and more cultural Indigenous content in its courses. And as I said earlier, University of Lethbridge is going through this whole exercise as we speak with regard to indigenization, not just courses, but throughout the whole university. So hopefully in the next few years, we will have teachers being turned out that will be in a much better position to teach and be more effective teachers of Indigenous students and other cultural, other students from other cultures too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sharon, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Leroy covered it quite well. You have to start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
It's unfortunate it's 2021, but it's never too late.
When I was a student at University of Montana, I'm originally from Montana. One of the requirements to get your teaching certification was that you would take so many units, or whatever they called it back then, of Indigenous studies, or they used to call it Indian studies. And there was a pushback. And the legislature, actually, the Montana legislature passed it. There was such a pushback at that time that they rescinded it. It was a really sad day, I felt, because I had been so hungry to learn more about Indigenous people around the world. And I had no interest, I'll be honest, I had no interest in studying about France, England, except for the basic stuff. I wanted to know more about Dene and how the Navajo and the Dene split, and how, you know, their language is so similar. The ones from the Southwest and the ones from Northwest Territories. Those kind of things were not known to me. I had to research all of that. And when I got to university, which was, you know, that should have been told like in grade 7 or 8 or whatever. So I'm an advocate of what Leroy is saying. You can always go and get resources through the local people that, you know, like Catholic Central is an example. They have a lot of dedicated people there. U of L and University, Lethbridge Community College also. So there is a huge movement going on, not just here, but across the world, to recover, to maintain, and to move forward, especially with the languages, because the land and the languages are paired so so closely. That's my thought anyway.
I agree 100%.
So another question is, if either you or both of you were Prime Minister of Canada for 1 year, what are the top 5 things you would influence?
Personally, I would never want to be Prime Minister of Canada because it's a colonial state, so I don't think I'd want to be there, but maybe there's some redeeming features of it, I don't know.
Okay,
That being flippant.
yeah. Leroy, you were Prime Minister for 1 year. What are your top 5 priorities?
If I was Prime Minister, okay, first of all, I would make sure everybody understands what the Constitution of Canada is really about. Again, most people don't know. They just hear the word Constitution, and that's all they know about it. Okay, that's about the extent. But they don't really know the deep meaning of what a constitution is. You see, most people grow up, especially the older generation. Okay, the older generation were born with a system of government that can best be described by parliamentary supremacy. In other words, Parliament can do anything, okay? Whereas a constitutional form of government is something where a document like a constitution limits and circumscribes what government can do. See, and to a large extent, today, the government, is still, even though we have a constitution in place, they're still kind of operating on the notion of supremacy. They haven't gotten away from that notion totally yet. It may take another generation of politicians and so on to totally get away from the notion of parliamentary supremacy. Say, the example I give is I grew up with the, with the imperial system of measurement and not the metric. See, and I still think in imperial measurements. I do all the conversions and so on. See, whereas somebody that grew up with the metric, hey, they have no problems with that. Say, well, I think that notion of parliamentary and constitutional government is kind of the same thing. So that would definitely be an educational thing that I would, go for. I definitely would go for, doing something about environmental issues. Because for every drop of water, for instance, that's misused, I have to remember that I, as an adult, I am 60 to 70% water. Okay, I have to remember that. I also have to remember that only 3% of all the water in the world is fresh water. And that's what the 6 to 7 billion people on Earth fight over, that 3%. See? And so we have to be very, very diligent about how we use water and other resources. See, so doing something about those resources, environmental issues, and of course, climate change is something that I fully support. You know, so if I was prime minister, hey, it would be down to basics that would say, hey, what gives existence to human beings? Okay, well, if there's no water around, we're going to go down the road of Neanderthal man. As I jokingly say, I used to text Neanderthal man. You know, I used to text him. But where is he now? See, he's gone. We're going to be gone if we don't watch what we do. That's what I would be pushing for if I were prime minister.
Okay, thank you, Leroy. That is so true. Okay, somebody wants to know, what stage is the legislation at in Canada?
They're talking about UNDRIP, are they?
I think they're talking about the UNDRIP.
I call it UNDRIP.
Yeah.
UNDRIP. Oh,
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because,
C-15.
well, I guess may come as a shock to people, but I'm not in favor of this way that Canada has approached this legislation. They ignored us. They picked and chose who they're going to create manufacturer consent with. I think there's a lot of undermining of the original intention of the declaration by the way they approach it. So I have a lot of issues about it and how it's going. I mean, really, it's a work plan, a 3-year work plan. And unfortunately, I was around in 1982 when Papa Trudeau promised Margaret Thatcher that if they got the Constitution brought back from England, that they would do a complete review of the legislation in Canada and change it in relation to treaties, which they never did. So seeing it in legislation now, I'm not overly optimistic, but they have dedicated $32 million to it. So somebody's going to make money.
That's for sure. Okay, here's a question, Sharon, that someone is interested in. If you could radically influence major Canadian change in policy or whatever, what would it be?
I would implement the treaties. I would implement the treaties by making available. Canada is using our resources and makes themselves very wealthy, but our people are not, don't share in that wealth. And so implementation of the treaties would be that the wealth of the country that is our country would come to our nations, so that our people would not always have to be standing there with our hand out. That to me would be the most important thing that could happen, would be to implement the treaties. The spirit and intent of those treaties needs to be implemented. The way it's going on right now, it's, Canada constantly nickel and diming us and even giving us a penny, which doesn't even exist anymore, but still gives it to us and tells us to survive on that. And then people turn around and say, what's wrong with you Indians? If they only knew what happens in our communities with the government programs and services that they have, people would be shocked. They would be ashamed of the way Canada has been treating our people. But implementation of the treaties for me would do everything for our people and would do everything for Canada to make it the country that they think they want to be. But right now, the way things are, it's not working, because if people really understood the way they roll out money, like how much we have to write papers and reports for the little dollars we get, they think, oh yeah, that's money, that's free money. No, it's not. It's treaty money. This is from our
Yes.
territories, So I think that one thing, implement the treaties, it would make a big difference across the country.
Okay, excellent. That's exactly how a lot of us feel. For Leroy, are you essentially saying that the Canadian government is simply not adhering to the very constitution which Canada subscribed to?
Let me put it this way. I'm trying to remember the political philosopher that came up with the word, the concept of, they call it the grunt norm, GRUNDNORM, grunt norm. Okay. What the grunt norm stands for really speaks to the ultimate basis of what the law, okay. But the question is, what is the ultimate base? What is the ultimate foundational base of the law? Okay. Well, in the search for that ultimate base, that ultimate foundational base, there don't seem to be an agreement as to what this ultimate foundational base is. Okay? So really then the de facto, the law, the Constitution and the law really becomes what the government can get away with. See? So the real law is what government can get away with. So you can have the best constitution in the world on a piece of paper, but if you never reach that grunt norm, it really de facto comes down to what government can get away with, because we can never pin down what the ultimate foundational base is.
Good answer. Okay, here's one for both of you. In the Bill C-15, most of the articles start out with the word states. Will consult. States shall take effective measures. States shall take the necessary steps, etc., and etc. Who is the state, and do you trust the state to put your interests above their own?
Well, the simple answer is the state is Canada.
Mm.
And Canada decides. See, that's the problem with the creation of that legislation. It completely runs against all the work of the Declaration, because it was supposed to be a collaborative approach and people are supposed to be working, but the state ultimately decides. And so Canada's colonial project continues. I personally think Canada is afraid of us, but that's my own impression. Rather than sitting down and actually talking to us, they try to hide behind the constitutional bushes, as Leroy has articulated, what they can get away with. I don't know if Leroy agrees with me or not.
Yeah. See, when we're talking about the state, the laws, both international and nationally, we're talking about a situation where you cannot have a law that's going to have the effect of, destroying the integrity of the state. Now, if you can, a simple example is if you were entering into a contract between yourself and somebody else, that contract cannot affect the integrity of your being. Okay. So in other words, if I'm Christian, that contract cannot say you have to stop being Christian, see, in order to enter into this contract, see, because my whole being is based on Christianity, see? And that's what was happening with the residential schools. What they were trying to do was, change, the whole being of those Indian kids. See, the integrity of their being, their cultural being. See, well, when, most laws are, it's taken for granted in international law that you cannot pass laws and conventions that will change the integrity of the state. See, so in other words, hey, we cannot have a convention that's going to mess up Canada into something totally different than what it is now. See? So that's something people have to understand and so on. And that's where respect between sovereigns comes in, see? And that's where the treaties, as Sharon is pointing out, sharing, hey, we were two sovereigns that entered into a treaty, and we have to respect that sovereignty of each other. Yeah.
But I think too that one of the things that never gets discussed in this country at any level is the fact that there's legal pluralism in this country. There's two systems running side by side. That was guaranteed at the time the treaty was made. We didn't give up our legal system in order to enter into the treaty. We used our legal system to enter into the treaties. And so we have our own laws. We have our own way of doing things. All you have to do is live in a community for any length of time, and you can see with your own eyes that our laws are different than what I would say outside laws are. And legal pluralism is alive in this country, but people are trying to turn a blind eye to it and try to impose one system again onto us. And that's really what is going to cause a lot of trouble, I think.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, here's an interesting question. The learning of connection, businesses bring in a token teacher for their businesses. Do you think they work, or are they just being band-aidish, trying to look inclusive?
Well, I think it's, it depends on who they bring in and what kind of information they're putting out there. The fact that they want to bring somebody in is a step forward. Now, what they're learning is another question, but eventually corporations and companies now are learning, the World Bank has sort of put the heads down, and the IMF has said things to them about them engaging Indigenous people. So I think it's going to percolate down into the corporate structures that they cannot make decisions without talking to the Indigenous peoples, and they're going to learn the hard way. People are going to stop investing with them if Indigenous peoples' rights are not recognized and protected. So as the environment crisis builds in the world, and people see that the environment is under serious threat, and where the environment is protected right now is mostly within indigenous hands, and so people notice that, and so there's going to be a real, I think, there's a real reckoning coming, and it's better if companies start taking issues seriously and start addressing them. And they are going to have pressure put on them. They don't want to have their funding disappear, and people are starting to look at not funding them, defunding. It's a fairly major issue now, especially coming out of the European Union in relation to Indigenous rights, and it'll percolate into the Americas. So I don't think if they think they're trying to do a band-aid, they might find out that there's going to be more than just, they think they're paying lip service putting a band-aid on. It's not going to happen. I don't think, anyway.
Let me respond to that as follows, and that is, it used to be pretty popular, and it's still popular. Many of these corporations, businesses, and organizations used to have advisory groups. In this case, Indigenous advisory groups, elders and so on. Well, what the Indigenous communities are starting to say is, I don't want to just be an advisor. I want to sit at your corporate table. I want to be a board of director. I don't want to just be an advisor. I want to sit at your board of directors table. Okay. I want to be part of the decision making. Okay. So I guess that gives you the difference about being band-aid-ish.
Okay, thank you. Not quite sure what this question is saying, but I'll read it out anyway. What would both of you say if you truly had all of humanity's full attention for just one entire minute?
I've got a very easy answer. Let's talk. Yeah, let's talk. If we can talk, then we'll understand each other. My response to people has always been, if you're the boss, and if you're the decision maker, if you're the CEO, etc., you should never be afraid of complaints and so on from your employees, the people below you, and so on. Why? Because that's how you know what people want. See, that's how you know what people want. See? And so the best way to resolve those is let's talk. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if I had just 1 minute in front of the whole world, I would say, let's talk.
Thank you, Leroy.
If I had 1 minute, I'd tell them to remember that all of the creation came before them, and they have an obligation to make sure that creation continues. Because if, as Leroy said, if it disappears, the water disappears, the human is not going to last. So everybody has to pull up their socks and start thinking about what are they doing to help the creation to survive, because everybody is affected by that.
Exactly. Excuse me. This is from another person. It seems people think that there's a magic wand, and when they go far, wrecking the earth, that Indigenous people will fix it magically. I think that's more of a statement than a question, but it's an observation by this person.
Well, I think the earth can heal itself. The creation has gifted us with the ability to heal, but you have to give it time. And that's what people don't seem to want to do, is give it time to heal. So like Leroy was talking about water. I question, how come we use clean drinking water to flush toilets? I find that such a waste of water. So one little thing could change a lot of things. But we have to, and the pandemic should have taught us something, that what do we really need to survive day to day, and what we don't need, we should forget about it.
Yeah.
And so it's an issue of over use of our mother, and she's suffering. And do we want to let her continue to suffer, or do we want to help her? Do we really need all these things that people think they have to have? And so we should examine all that. I think that's important, because I think the pandemic has forced us to think about it. Although people don't want to, I think they should.
Okay, excellent. We've been reading at the library this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And that's the very thing that she talks about is, they have a trickster guy that comes in and wrecks everything, and apparently used to eat people. And so what the symbolism is, like, what are we letting eat us up is my take on it. And she brought up a lot of things. And then I looked when she said, including hoarding our clothes, I looked in my closet and I thought, oh my God, I got to get rid of stuff. And it just brought that awareness that I knew, but still, here was somebody that I don't even know has thought this out thoroughly and says, look, what are you doing, human? And she calls us in their culture, the human beings are the little brothers, little sisters, because they were the last ones formed after the plants and the animals came. So that was quite an interesting insight on my part. Okay, let me see, what else do we have here? Do enough people know how to effectively communicate? If so, wait, I can't, they're so used to dictating or just obeying or placating. What would teach them? Or who would teach them?
Do we need a teacher?
Mm.
We tell stories, and that's where our elders come in. They tell us stories. And it's from these stories that we learn things and so on. And that's what Robin Kimmer, Braiding Sweetgrass, was very effective in bringing those points out. So I would recommend people to read Braiding Sweetgrass. It tells that deal about telling stories, but it also is about the environment, about native science, and so on. So it's a very good book to read.
Okay. Okay. Let me see, what do we have? Okay.
Linda, is it okay if I ask a question?
Oh, of course, Perry.
So my question for the both of you, Sharon and Leroy, is, all of us live in a community, whether it's the city of Lethbridge or communities across Canada. And I think many communities are trying to understand what reconciliation means to them, what a new imagined relationship looks like between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And the role of local government is quite different than the roles of provincial or territorial or federal government. And I'm just curious, because we're, as every city in Alberta is about to go into a municipal election, what should be at top of mind for us right now, thinking about the role of local government, and what should we be thinking about in terms of the perspectives and priorities of would-be elected officials vying for our attention right now? What should we be thinking? What questions should we be asking them?
Do you want to start, Leroy, or should I?
Go ahead.
Okay. I the pandemic has really affected people's finances. I'm talking about everyone, governments, individuals, everybody's been affected by it. And so if people are running for office, I don't think you should be promising the moon and the stars, because they're already up there, so they don't need to be brought down here. But I think the thing is, it's incremental of what you can do, and look at things that don't cost money or a lot of money, that can have an immense visual or it'll sit in your head, and you think, yeah, that really means something, and I can do that as a person, so something that can have a meaningful impact that also moves the relationship forward. And I'm living right now, in Edmonton, and there's a municipal election coming up. I guess it's all across the province, but the city of Edmonton renamed all the wards in the city using Indigenous names. They've included a Blackfoot name too, Cree and Dene. So that, is something that everybody, people are, what ward do you live in? And they actually, have had instructions on the websites of how to pronounce them properly, so that people can start to have some kind of pride in knowing that this is the word that they come from, and this is how you pronounce it, and this is what it means, and this is why it's called that. So that's not a huge, it's not $1 million investment. It might have been a couple hundred or maybe 1,000 to do that work. I don't know what it costs, but that in itself starts to reintroduce the language into a city which has people from all over the world, and then they all know that there were Indigenous peoples here before, so I'm still here. So let's how you going to do that? Like they say, the city of Edmonton raised the Treaty 6 flag downtown at the city hall. So now, and then I was just driving through Lethbridge, not Lethbridge, but Lloydminster a couple of weeks ago, and the radio station, the local radio station said, blah, 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 this radio station, this call number, coming to you from the heart of Treaty 6 territory. And I thought, whoa, I nearly drove off the road. Listening to, hearing that on the radio, that's like, it's sort of unprompted. They just now part of their station identification. So, that was really, that to me is something, that they say that. So I think people have to think, what can they do individually? What can they do collectively? And, and the city, it's, they're not there's not a huge amount of finances that can be allocated, but, start with something small and meaningful. I like the idea about the library that's using that book, Reading Sweetgrass. Like, that's a very, good step that people can listen to and start understanding. So, like, I challenge people to find things that are not expensive but can be meaningful, like putting a park bench on the bluff or something, and saying this park bench is here because you're looking at this is a scene, whatever you're looking at, and it relates to the kind of and the Confederacy, way in this, the history of this area. So, that kind of little thing, people come by, they sit, they read it, they keep on moving. But, something that kind of connects the people with where they are and what they're doing can be very helpful, because when you see people then who are indigenous, it may want you engage. You might want to engage in a conversation with them and say, are you from this area, or have you lived here a long time? I'm just new in the area, whatever. Whatever kind of conversation you want to have, because this is our land. We didn't come from anywhere, and we have a lot to say about it. And so I think that those are the kinds of conversations that anybody can anticipate. I don't know if they have a Treaty 7 flag raised at the city of Lethbridge outside the city hall. If they don't, they should. I don't know. Perry probably knows more about that than I do, but those little things have a great deal of meaning. Encouraging radio stations to say, we are, coming to you from, the Treaty 7 territory. That's a biggie. I mean, I was really impressed with that. I don't know who encouraged those guys, but wow, okay, right on. So those little kind of things, make you think, well, okay, maybe the work has been worthwhile.
Exactly.
Let me speak to Perry's question, and that I guess I would come at it from the point of view of a little saying I always whispered into my granddaughter's ears, and that is, she loved playing basketball, and she was on a school basketball team when they were playing and so on. And I tell her, you could be the smartest person in the world. You could be the best basketball player in the world. In other words, you could be the best in anything and so on. But if you don't know how to get along with people, you'll never get anywhere. Yeah? In spite of being the best in whatever field. If you don't know how to get along with people, you'll never get anywhere. Okay? So from that perspective, in this coming election, I haven't heard any government officials, I don't know how long, mention anything about a resource that they have but never make use of. And it's the human resource. Say, human resource. How many Alberta governments have ever talked about the human resource in Alberta? Okay, let's start using that resource. Mm-hmm. We just keep thinking about oil and gas and those type of natural resources. But let's start talking about the human resource. And that would lead to this whole notion about relationships, which would mean, hey, if we can get along with each other, hey, the whole notion about budgets, finances, money, etc., will not be such a big issue. See? So I challenge anybody that's listening that might be running for office this coming fall to talk about and approach their political dream from a human resource base.
Okay, we're winding down now. We have about 6 minutes left. 6.5, no. But there is a person here that says something that's kind of how they're talking about storytelling. How do Indigenous get their word out of stewardship and the help needed for sustainability? How would that happen? Indigenous fatigue settles in fast for the general public. That is a really popcorn question, and it's sparkling all over the place, because I sometimes feel our allies or even our non-allies are just tired of hearing about Indigenous people. How would we respond to that? I think it's a legitimate question.
We left to talk, and that's what I keep saying. Let's talk to each other. That's how we know what everybody knows what the other person is all about. Okay. And it's in this particular case, we're talking Indigenous. But there are a bunch of it, and remember, supposedly Canada is multicultural. So there are a bunch of other cultures out there that we need to know about and that we need to communicate with. Say, and we're not very good at listening. Okay, when somebody's talking, we don't listen. What we're doing is we're thinking about the comeback. Okay, when somebody is talking, we're really thinking about the comeback and not really listening to what somebody is saying. Okay, so what we really need to do is listen, really listen with heart to what the other people say. And that's how we get to really understand them. So communication is very, very important. So I keep saying, let's talk.
Let's talk.
I always tell
Hey,
them, I always tell young people, they sometimes say to me, I heard that person saying that before, telling me that before, why do I have to hear it again? And I always say, well, the reason that you're hearing it again is because you didn't learn the lesson that you were being told the first time. So listen to what they're being told and try to live what you're being told. And so if people think that Indigenous peoples continue to say the same thing, then you have to listen to what we're trying to tell you, because it's important. And to say, well, they're always saying that. Well, why are we always saying that, and what can be done to fix it? So we'll keep saying it until it's fixed.
yes.
That's how we're trained, and that's how we have to. That's what our obligations are. So we have to keep doing it. May not make people happy, but we're going to do it anyway.
Okay, thank you. I agree. As a child, I didn't listen too much. Now, as an elder, I'm trying my best. I'm still learning. I still see myself as a child. One thing someone asked about is any resources you have. We already mentioned braiding sweetgrass. We mentioned the TNR reports, which the library, by the way, has all the books. They're very hard to read. So, but if you really want to know the stories, go there. They have their website. And of course, the UNDRIP, as you call it. That's really interesting. So if you know of any resources people can tap into, I believe on our website we did put up some books that people could read, fiction and nonfiction. We have a list already available, but maybe there's something else you might steer them towards.
Well, I wrote a book on international law called Our Elders Understand Our Rights. I think somebody should read Tamara Starblanket's book on genocide, which is very good book. There's a lot of materials out there that are available online and free on some of these issues. I think you just always have to figure out what you're looking for and try to focus in on that. I think we're at the end of the time.
Yeah, Leroy, did you have anything you want to add?
No, well,
Okay.
stop there.
Okay, well, just to summarize, I think the main thing here is let's talk. Let's follow our treaties the way they were written and agreed upon. And let's really listen to people, especially when it's affecting their land, which, as we know, Blackfoot Confederacy is quite a big chunk of land. And most of North America, if not all, is Indigenous land. So we really need to pay attention to what our colleagues and our Indigenous people, scientists, scholars, just the guy on the street are saying, because they know. You'd be surprised how intelligent and resilient that we really are. But I want us to be more than resilient. I want us to be able to thrive. Like Sharon said at the beginning, that those resources should be coming back to us. Whatever is going out should be coming back. I just want to thank Jonathan, who's been silently watching and making sure things go well. I want to thank the city of Lethbridge for organizing this and getting the Lethbridge Library involved. It's been such an honor to be part of this. And of course, Leroy and Sharon, my heartfelt thanks go out to you. And I believe we have recorded this and it's going to be put up on our, I think it's YouTube page, something like that. Okay, because there were people that couldn't make it, that really want to join. Okay, see you later.
Yeah.
Get a listen.